Today's passage comes from Revelation, not a book you hear me preach on very often, in part because the circumstances in which it was written and the claims it's making, despite what our evangelical and fundamentalist compatriots think, have very little to nothing to do with anything applicable to life in the 21st century, or any other century beyond the date of its having actually been written. In fact, reformer Martin Luther wrote of Revelation that he could in no way detect that the Holy Spirit produced it, and Christ is neither taught nor known in it. Thomas Jefferson describes it as the ravings of a maniac, no more worthy nor capable of explanation than the incoherences of our own nightly dreams. With all its obscure and phantasmagorical imagery, the whole thing is super hard for modern readers to comprehend, but not so for the original audience, who were used to deciphering the codes of apocalyptic literature. So let me be clear. Revelation is an interesting period piece that comments on the current events of its time and encourages beleaguered Christians to keep the faith despite the challenges they were facing. Internal clues point to it having been written around 95-ish of the Common Era during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. But it is not predicting anything happening in our day and has nothing to do with the future. It's not a mysterious puzzle of biblical prophecy to be figured out with your magic decoder ring. So why read it at all? Because some things about the human condition never change, and our passage today is evidence of that. It's a part of a series of messages from Jesus to the 7 churches in Asia. This one addressed to the church at Laodicea, evidently a wealthy and self-satisfied bunch. Jesus condemns their smug attitude and their lukewarmness. Later in the passage, Jesus basically says, "You think you're so great, but you're blind, naked, and of all these other churches, the more to be pitied." So, that being said, let's see if we can salvage a bit of wisdom from what is otherwise a text that has been rejected as much as it's been embraced.
Our words of wisdom are from Revelation chapter 3, verses 15 and 16.
Jesus said, "I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. Would that you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth."
Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Thanks be to God.
A number of years ago, I had the privilege of attending a Valley Interfaith Project event where the keynote speaker was the legendary Ernie Cortez, one of the founders of VIP's parent organization, the Industrial Areas Foundation. The first time I met Ernie, I was more than a little starstruck. Here he was, a social justice rock star, surrounded by doting United Methodist clergy, breathlessly awaiting whatever pearl of wisdom that Ernie might share with us. He looked around at the group of us and shook his head with disapproval. Then he pointed his finger at us and declared, "You know what's wrong with all of you Methodists? You're too nice." Huh? Yeah, and he's right. As a mostly white, middle-class bastion of the status quo, most United Methodists have been anesthetized into almost total inaction. We cruise along, assimilated into the role of a benevolent service organization, there to help in times of disaster, but out of fear of tainting our reputation for being nice, are hesitant to dig in and disrupt the status quo. And we've been stuck in this rut, along with the rest of much of middle-class white America, for generations. In his letter from Birmingham jail, Dr. King scolded his white clergy colleagues. "I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice." As our guide to being people of the way, Kurt Struckmeyer, points out, whether it's in religion or in politics, moderates and centrists like to think of themselves as common sense people who keep an open mind on issues, are willing to listen to different viewpoints, think for themselves, and perhaps most importantly, pride themselves in not embracing extreme beliefs or policies. Although they may lean one way or another, moderates are so afraid of the labels of liberal or conservative that they simply opt for taking refuge in the safe middle, preferring to blend in so they don't stand out. And then, in their insulated bubble, they convince themselves that they're simply above any fray that afflicts the rest of us in the real world. Others feel so jaded by the unending cavalcade of tragedies in the world that they've convinced themselves that there's nothing they could ever do that would make a difference anyway. As my favorite jazz philosopher Mose Allison sings in his anthem to apathy, "I don't worry about a thing."
You know this world is just a one big troubled spot, 'cause some have plenty and some have not. You know I used to be troubled, but I finally saw the light. Now I don't worry about a thing, 'cause I know nothing's going to be alright. Don't waste your time trying to be a go-getter. Things will get worse before they get any better. You know there's always somebody playing with dynamite. But I don't worry about a thing, 'cause I know nothing's going to be alright.
So, whether one's moderation is a result of apathy or a conscious decision to simply play it safe, there are serious consequences when moderation and indecision moves from being a habit to becoming the goal itself. When it does, the practitioners essentially become hopelessly inert and inactive, or perhaps, as Jesus would say, lukewarm. In revering neutrality and not rocking the boat, moderates, whether they know it or not, are still taking a position. By clinging to the center and not wrestling with the pros and cons, the hot and cold of real issues, they essentially do two things. They make a decision to prioritize their own comfort over everything else. And two, they virtually guarantee that current power structures and policies, no matter how unjust, will remain in place. And here's the deal. A choice to remain silent is a moral choice. As Desmond Tutu said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel made a similar point in his acceptance speech for the 1987 Nobel Peace Prize. "We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." And not to put too fine a point on it, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The hottest place in hell is reserved for those who remain neutral in times of great moral conflict." An individual who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it. As many of you are aware, United Methodist delegates from around the world are right in the middle of our denomination's General Conference in North Carolina this week. In the aftermath of nearly 25% of our churches disaffiliating to form a new denomination advocating the exclusion of LGBTQ plus folks, lots of decisions have already been made, including a constitutional amendment to break up the denomination even further to allow regional churches in Africa, Eurasia, and the Philippines to make their own decisions independent of North American influence. These are decisions that have been 40 plus years in the making. And why has it taken so long? In large part because our denomination has historically made an idol out of unity, of making sure to include everybody, even those with toxic opinions. That, along with the fear of inaction of moderates in the church who, even in the face of injustice being done to our LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters, opted for inaction over compassion, status quo over empathy, and spiritual violence over inclusivity. And now, with most of the reactionary churches off congratulating themselves on establishing their own little ghetto of bigotry, the rest of us are left with a big decision. As you may know, the whole conflict revolves around just one phrase in our Book of Discipline, that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Along with that comes rules banning same-sex marriage, punishments for clergy performing same-sex marriages, and prohibitions against LGBTQ plus clergy. Now, while oversimplified, our General Conference delegates will be deciding to go one of three ways. Keep the exclusive language, unlikely. Simply eliminate the exclusive language, which is a critical first step. Or eliminate the exclusive language and replace it with language affirming the inclusion and affirmation of our LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters. The big question is, will the body end up voting to be hot, cold, or remain mired in inaction? A decision, in my opinion, worthy of being spewed out of Jesus' mouth. Whatever their decision ends up being, each of us is still left to examine our own tendencies in this area. Most of us, whether we've been raised Methodist or not, are raised to prioritize being nice, which may be true on a one-on-one interpersonal level, but taken as a whole, polling of church-going people show some pretty troubling tendencies. Back in 2014, polling found that most Christians believed that CIA torture of suspected terrorist detainees was justified. They defended capital punishment. They were opposed to legal reproductive rights for women. They were hostile towards same-sex marriage and transgender rights, and were even resistant toward women in leadership roles, especially in the church. So while you'd think being a follower of Jesus would make people more loving, compassionate, and accepting, based on significant bodies of research, that theory doesn't seem to hold up. Granted, as individuals, people are often able to transcend their selfish interests to consider the needs of others. But it seems that in larger social groups, especially churches, people lose their capacity for empathy. So, here we are, people of the way, striving to be practitioners of the gospel of compassion, peace, justice, and social inclusion that Jesus proclaimed. And yet, many churches continue to emphasize a message of hyper-individualized spiritual comfort, eternal security, and support of the status quo of some of the worst aspects of American society. Look, when I was growing up, if you ever heard Revelation 3:15-16 quoted, it was in the context of a hellfire and brimstone sermon, calling out lukewarm Christians' lack of spiritual commitment. Lukewarm Christians were slackers. They skipped church. They didn't give. Evidently, the threat of being spewed out of Jesus' mouth was thought to be effective in whipping lazy, uncommitted Christians into shape. But that's not what it's about in its original context. The Laodiceans were lukewarm because they were comfortable and smug in their self-centered piety. They were neither hot nor cold because they valued moderation more than justice, comfort more than the risk of speaking out for the voiceless. So today, how many churches simply exist in maintenance mode, performing meaningless, entertaining social activities, going through the motions of a sterile liturgy, and keeping their members in an indifferent mindset? And this has always been the challenge for people of the way, deciding between comfort and respectability or the risk of taking action in support of Jesus' vision of a world full of justice and compassion. Even back in the 18th century, statesman and philosopher Edmund Burke complained about the paralysis of moderation and the tyranny of the undecided. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good people do nothing. The choice is yours. Back in the 1950s, an old hillbilly preacher invited Baptist preacher and activist Clarence Jordan to come guest speak at his church in rural South Carolina. Jordan arrived to find, to his surprise, a large, thriving, and thoroughly integrated congregation. A remarkable thing in that time and place, and sadly, still a remarkable thing. So Jordan asked the man how such a thing came about. The man said, "Well, back in the day, this church was just a small, all-white congregation of a few dozen families. Then one day our preacher up and died. When no one volunteered to preach, I got appointed. So, on that first Sunday, I opened up the Bible and I put my finger down to see where to preach from. The verse said, 'In Christ there is no Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female.' So I preached on that. When the service was over, the deacons took me in the back room and they told me they didn't want to hear that kind of preaching anymore." Jordan asked, "Well, what did you do then?" And the old preacher answered, "I fired them deacons." "How come they didn't fire you?" asked Jordan. "Well, they'd never hired me," the old preacher responded. "And once I found out what bothered them people, I preached the same message every Sunday. Didn't take long before I had that church preached down to just 2 people. But," he said, "those 2 were committed. I made sure that any time after that, anybody who came into this church understood the message. And what you see here is the result of that." Friends, we're lucky. We're a part of a faith community here at the Fountains that has made it its business to go out on a limb to witness to what putting love first in the world looks like. When other churches in Fountain Hills actively dismissed other faith traditions and threatened their practitioners with an eternity in hell, we stepped up and created a safe and welcoming space that affirmed and partnered with our interfaith neighbors. When our own denomination was paralyzed with inaction regarding LGBTQ+ inclusion and affirmation, we took action to publicly declare ourselves a reconciling and welcoming congregation. And in response to so many people feeling excluded from the faith of their childhood for asking too many questions, we committed ourselves to embracing a progressive understanding of Christianity that pushes the boundaries of established theology and dogma. And it hasn't been easy. Threats are not unfamiliar. Befuddled visitors are frequent. Just 2 weeks ago, I was told by one person that she and her husband wouldn't be back because the Fountains didn't welcome white supremacists in its membership. Damn straight. So, now it's up to you. You're not ignorant of the challenge with your own neighbors and even your loved ones. But you have a supportive faith community. You have a vision of what being people of the way is all about. Don't let any temptation you might have to opt for the safety of moderation allow, through your inaction, evil to persist. Throughout history, those who consider themselves moderates have, by their relative silence, been complicit with the evils of racism, misogyny, heterosexism, anti-Semitism, ethnic cleansing, war, poverty, and oppression to flourish by their inability to decide. So decide. To be neutral is not neutrality at all. It is taking a side and maintaining a direction that may very well be supporting oppression and injustice for people at the margins of society, exactly the people Jesus has called us to be in solidarity with. Don't be lukewarm. Don't be undecided. Take a side. And be well.